Hey everybody, what is going on? Hexlex here. I've got another Master Duel video for you guys. Today we're actually going to be doing another metagame analysis, this time for Season 3. So last time we did one of these, it was at the end of Season 2, right? And this time we're doing it a little bit sooner. It's currently the 21st of March. So why are we doing it a little bit sooner this time? Well, there is one main reason that I am doing it right now, and that's because of the potential release, the probable, in my opinion, release of new archetypes and cards that's going to be coming up here, in my opinion, probably right after the beginning of Season 4, right? Because if we look at the shop and we look at a lot of the packs in the shop, we see that they are in the shop. How many times did I say in the shop? You can see that they're going to be in there until April 3rd. And that is also when the normal and rare event ends, after having just, given us a bunch of gems. By the way, you should definitely be saving your gems now, and also the gems that you are getting from the normal and rare event for the probable release of new cards. Again, probably coming around April 3rd, when the shop update rolls in. So, the reason that I want to get the Season 3 metagame analysis out now, before the end of the season, is because when Season 4 drops again at the beginning, we're very likely going to see all these new cards coming in, and that's going to very much shake up the meta and the tier list here. So I just want to get this in now while this meta and this format is still relevant for a good bit longer. And yeah, just make sure that we cover it while it is relevant. So we are once again here at MasterDuelMeta.com, and we can see the tier list here. I mean, if we look at the actual decks that are on here themselves, you might be like, oh, okay, what is it? Tri-Zoo, Drytron, Virtual World, Eldlich, Adamancipator, Lyrilisk, Tri-Brigade. Okay, whatever. These are all the same decks we're used to seeing, right? Like, what is there to look at here? Well, there is actually a lot of things to look at. If you take a very nuanced look at the list here, obviously we can see that not only have the power rankings themselves changed, but also as a result, the positions of each deck on the tier list have. There's also been, obviously, trends in how each of these decks are played, as opposed to how they were played during the second season, rather. So we're going to be looking not only at this tier list, but also at each of these decks as well. We're going to be seeing what the trends for them look like and what that means as a result. So we do see a trend here on the tier list itself. We are seeing an upward trend in Drytron, and indeed, they currently have a power level of 14.7, which is just below the threshold of actually technically defining them as a tier 1 deck. Now, as always, we want to notice over here that we are in tournaments only mode. If you click that off, the tier list is obviously going to be looking a fair bit different there as opposed to tournaments only. However, I do think tournaments only is still a valid way to look at the format, because I believe it's pretty representative of what my personal tier list for all these decks are. Not only that, but also the tournaments and the ladder are actually going to influence each other a bit more than you might think. Like, tournaments are often best of 3, so those formats are obviously very different. However, what you can build in Master Duel is often what you are using on ladder. Like, you still have to, commit to the deck, so by crafting them. So in that regard, I think a lot of people are using in tournaments decks that they are familiar with on ladder, and of course ladder is obviously the go-to place where you would want to test a deck for a tournament. So I think these formats are more entwined than it might seem, so I think tournaments only mode is still a valid way to look at the ladder here. We're also seeing an upward trend in Virtual World and Eldlich. All the tier 2 decks really are seeing an upward trend in their power levels, and we're also seeing a downward trend in Zoodiac Tri-Brigade a little bit. I mean, it's still got a power level of 20, like it's still pretty far and above the rest of the format, but it's not quite as big of a gap as we saw in the Season 2 metagame analysis, and that we've been seeing for a lot of Season 3 as well. And I think a lot of the reason for that is simply that more people are not only more experienced playing against Tri-Zoo, but they're also playing some more tech options for Tri-Zoo as well. In addition, Tri-Zoo, as I used it, is often a deck that is used to get to Plat 1 very quickly, and then, as I do, people who were using Tri-Zoo start to use other decks once they've hit Plat 1. Another thing that we can see as the season goes on is that decks that are perceived to counter the meta in and of themselves end up becoming more meta. This is why Drytron is on an upward trend. This is why we're now seeing Eldlich in tier 2 where it was in tier 3 for pretty much most of, if not all of Season 3 up to, recently. And it was there in Season 2 as well, I believe. There was even times where we didn't see Eldlich in Tier 3 even. Like, it just wasn't on the tier list here. But as the format tends to progress on, more people turn to Eldlich because it's, it's an easy metagame counter. It's easy to build. Lots of people, it's like, very accessible, both in terms of the craft points and learning the deck. So it's one that people tend to turn to, again, as a perceived counter against the meta. But of course, by seeing more play, it ends up becoming more meta, and it ends up becoming the meta that it intends to counter in some ways. And we'll actually be seeing kind of trends of that in Eldlich itself, but we're going to start from the top and take a look at Zoodiac Tri-Brigade. There's honestly not a whole lot that's different here, particularly if you look at the extra deck. Like, the lowest percentage rate you see of any card played in this extra deck is 97%. I would definitely call the Zoodiac Tri-Brigade extra deck solved right now. Like, you pretty much always play these 15 cards. These 15 cards you see here, they're the 15 that I use in my extra deck because they're just the best options. Pretty far and away. I don't think there's any real contest for it. I suppose as far as the main deck itself goes, again, we're seeing pretty much the same numbers that we would see, or that we did see rather at the end of Season 2. Even Pot of Desires here. It's funny, I see a lot of people in the comments talk about how they hate Desires, they take it out, and how it's no good in the deck because it's like, it wronged you this many times, or it screwed this game over for me. And yeah, it does happen, but I mean, if we look at the actual numbers here, even the people who aren't playing 3 Pot of Desires, of which there are 17%, 12 of that 17% are still playing 2 copies. So I think Desires is definitely right in this deck. I think it's not just fine in the deck, I think it's even optimal. I think it's pretty easy for us to let our personal experiences kind of paint a bias of how good we think a card is. And not even just a card, of how good we think a meta is in general. This is actually something I've kind of been thinking of making like its own video about, is like analyzing a metagame and also trying to remove your own personal bias out of it, because it is something that you proactively have to do, right? Like, you might have a day where you lose against 8 Eldliches in a row because they all went first and they all set 4 cards and summoned a Golden Lord and passed, and they all flipped Skill Drain and Rivalry and Goes In, or there can only be one, whichever one of those hurts your deck. And that can definitely happen to you. That does not mean that Eldlich is a tier 1 deck. That does not mean that Eldlich is an overpowered deck. That doesn't even mean that you necessarily have a bad matchup against Eldlich. That could just easily be variance, right? So, yeah, like I said, I've kind of been thinking about just making its own separate video, this idea of removing your own personal bias, because I have to do, I mean, I think it's something, like I said, you have to proactively do. I have to do it myself, too. I catch myself thinking like, oh, I've seen a lot of Drytron decks doing playing this recently, but like, no, you gotta make sure that you are your own personal sample size is always too small. That's kind of the gist of what I'm getting at here. Like, the amount of games that you play as an individual is never going to be reflective of the meta as a whole, because it's just simply not enough games. Like, there are tens of thousands of games being played, and even if you play hundreds, that's not going to be an accurate representation of the metagame. Anyway, like I said, that might be its own video someday. Let's talk about Zoodiac Tri-Brigade again. If we look at the trends here, the only one we really see is a downward trend in DD Crow, which makes sense to me. DD Crow was a very popular tech option at the beginning of Season 3, because it is a winged beast. It can be used as a tri-type for comboing, but it's also very good against Zoodiac Tri-Brigade in particular, because it can more or less negate a Tri-Brigade effect by banishing it out of the graveyard. It's not as useful against Drytron and Eldlich. Obviously, it can still be used against those decks, but a one-off DD Crow typically does not hurt them as much as it will hurt, like, Tri-Brigade Zoodiac. Like, if you DD Crow the Fractal, right, and then you just complete, or like the kit that gets sent, or the Nerval, whatever, you just stop the combo line right there. But Drytron, if you banish one of their things, they typically don't have too hard of a time playing around that. Banishing a Golden Lord is definitely a good play, but devoting a whole card to doing it, like in the form of DD Crow, isn't going to win you the game alone. So I don't think DD Crow is necessarily that great against Eldlich in particular. So I think that's why we're seeing the downward trend of it. As the format goes on, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing more people play decks like Eldlich, like Drytron, that they perceive as counters to the meta, and thus, as those decks are seeing more play, Tri-Zoo is playing less play, seeing less play, there's less of this incentive to play DD Crow. Okay, I think that's about going to cover it for Zoodiac Tri-Brigade here. Let's go ahead and move on to the next deck, which is good old Drytron. So, again, we're not seeing actually too many trends here, but one of the trends we are seeing that is honestly probably surprising, well, could be potentially surprising to you, is the downward trend of Herald of Ultimateness seeing play in 76% of Drytron decks at the moment. So what does that mean? Isn't Herald like the... I thought Herald was the OP card that negates all my stuff. Why is that seeing a downward trend in play? Well, honestly, I think a lot of the reason it's seeing a downward trend in play is because we're seeing an upward trend of play of the Herald of Perfection build. However, I actually can't be certain of this because if we look at the, deck statistics here, I'm actually not seeing Herald of Perfection here. So that's kind of surprising to me because we're seeing, like, Preparation of Rites, 2 of in 13% of decks. So, presumably, if Herald of Perfection, or rather, Herald of Perfection must see play in less than 13% of these Drytron decks, which, that makes sense to me. I'm just surprised it's not, more, and if it is or is not more, I'm surprised it's not reflected here. Because I suspect a potential upward trend in Herald of Perfection is why we are seeing a downward trend of Herald of Ultimateness. There is part of me that also wonders if maybe we're seeing a downward trend of Herald of Ultimateness as a result of, like, this stigma against it, right? By the way, I touched on this in my ban list video. I don't think Herald of Ultimateness or Perfection are the problems at all. It's definitely Ben 10 and Eva. Like, 100% it's Eva and Ben 10. Ben 10 needs to go to 1. Eva probably just needs to go to 0, but at the very least 1. I don't think putting Eva to 1 really does anything, though. I think it should just go to 0. Ben 10 has to go to 1. I've said this before. There's literally 0 chance this card does not go to 1. I would be extremely surprised if that were the case, but... yeah, I don't suspect a stigma against Herald of Ultimateness is why it sees a downward trend in play, or if it does, I can't imagine it makes for more than 1, maybe 2% of that downward trend, which is, I guess, still a significant bit, but, yeah, I don't know. So again, without seeing the stats for Herald of Perfection, which I suspect an upward trend of that is why Herald of Ultimateness would see a downward trend. But again, also, I'm not a Drytron player, so maybe a Drytron player in the comments would be able to shed some more insight into this this trend here. Maybe we are seeing more Drytron decks that just don't play Heralds at all. Maybe that's even optimal sometimes. Yeah, I don't know, but I would love to hear from you if you do know. And then we have Appalachia seeing a downward trend. This makes a lot of sense to me because Drytron doesn't need to dip into its extra deck all that much, and it definitely doesn't usually have enough extra monsters left over to make an Appalachia. So, again, that would make sense to me. But, yep, that's about, I think, all I've got to say about Drytron here. Let's go ahead and move on to the next deck, which is Virtual World. We see interesting trends here in Virtual World. We're actually seeing an upward trend of Nibiru, the Primal Being, and a downward trend of Psyframe, Gear, Gamma, and, of course, also the Driver, because the Gamma is seeing less play. So what does that mean? I think that is indicative of the fact that we are seeing such a high spike in Drytron. And not only Drytron, but we're seeing a spike in Virtual World. It's not as significant of one, but we are definitely seeing Virtual World seeing more play and also seeing its power level go up as the season goes on here. And what do Drytron and Virtual World both have in common? They summon a whole crap ton of monsters in order to make literally like any amount of plays. So that makes sense to me. It also makes sense that we are seeing less Psyframe Gear Gammas here because, well, the one-off monster negation is definitely not as good against, again, these decks that are activating a whole bunch of effects to doing a whole bunch of summons. The one-off monster effect negation is not as good. I'm personally not even that big of a fan of Psyframe Gear, Gamma, and Driver in general because you have to run Driver. Like, you have to run this dead vanilla card in your deck, and, like, you're committing 3 deck slots to getting 1 negation off, like 1 hand trap off. I don't know. It's just not that... I mean, I know that you could potentially get more than that if your Driver goes to the graveyard. I think that's the case anyway, right? This can bring him back from grave. Yeah. But, I mean, 90% of the time, from what I see, they're just going to get banished anyway, so I don't know. I'm not that big of a fan of the side-frame gears, and I definitely think it makes sense that it's seeing less play. However, one thing we do have to note as well is that the actual percentage itself, because it's very easy to be like, oh, upward trend, downward trend, so play this card, don't play this card. But we're seeing that the side frame gears still see play in about 68% of these virtual world decks, and the Nibiru's are still only seeing play in about 21% of them, right? And I think that's very important to note, because this is like a this time in the format specific trend. If we move into Season 4 without a ban list, which is looking like it's going to be the case, then I would suspect this trend to be reversed as Season 4 begins, and we see more of a variety of decks being played, and potentially, not guaranteed, but potentially less Drytron and Virtual World decks being played as well. Okay, yep, I think that's going to about do it for covering Virtual here. Let's take a look at Eldlich, where we're seeing some interesting trends here. I think the most interesting trend we see is actually a downward trend of Vanity's Emptiness. So that's pretty interesting, right? Because isn't Vanity's Emptiness like, I mean, it's at 1, it's got to be one of the most busted floodgates. Why is it seeing a downward trend in play? And I think the main reason for this is honestly probably that Eldlich is just seeing an upward trend in play. Now, there's kind of a twofold reason why that is an answer, right? The first is that obviously with more anti-meta decks being on the ladder, Vanity's Emptiness as a card does not tend to be as good in general. But I suspect an equal, if not greater factor is that more people are turning to Eldlich to climb. And I think the people who are turning to Eldlich to climb typically are either not using it as their main deck, or they're not having a whole lot of ultra rare craft points to invest in general. So as a result of either of those being the case, you would want to cut some of the less necessary ultra rares out of the deck. And I think Vanity's Emptiness is one of the ultra rares that you can get away without using in Eldlich. Eldlich is already a fairly, like, I don't want to call it a budget deck, but it doesn't use that many ultra rares, and those that it does can be used in a lot of other decks as well. Like, the only archetype specific ones you really need to commit are the 3 Eldlich, the Golden Lord, and then of course the Vanity's Emptiness. Well, of course, Vanity's Emptiness being the one of those that we are able to cut the most. Okay, apologies for that. So yeah, no, we were just discussing why Vanity's Emptiness, yeah, is seeing less play. I think because it is some combination of it being one of the less needed ultra rares to craft in the deck, and also because more Eldlich seeing play, more anti-meta, Vanity's Emptiness not quite as good. Another interesting trend we're seeing here is a downward trend of Pot of Extravagance, and then an opposing upward trend of Pot of Prosperity, which actually does make a fair bit of sense to me. The drawback of Prosperity dealing half damage for the rest of the turn is definitely not very important to Eldlich, who are not really concerned about ending the game swiftly, in one turn. They just kind of want to draw the game out more and basically, stall out, for lack of a better term. And I think because of that, it's not only just the damage effect, right? A lot of the cards that see play in Eldlich see play in multiple copies, like especially your floodgates like Skill Drain, like Gozen, like Rivalry. You tend to play a lot of copies of those cards, and a lot of ways to, like, access your Golden Lord. So with Eldlich, it does become less about finding more cards, as in with Extravagance, and more about finding a specific card, as in with Prosperity, like finding a Solemn Judgment to go with all your back row, or finding a Skill Drain if you don't have a floodgate to set up, or finding a way to summon your Golden Lord if you don't have a way to set that up. So that definitely does make sense to me. Again, if we actually look at the numbers themselves, though, Extravagance is still seeing play in 61% of Eldlich decks, as opposed to the Prosperity seeing play in about 24%. So I don't know. This is one where I could actually see the trend, though, and I would actually, if I was playing Eldlich, probably go along with it, right? But that's kind of the thing. We don't want to be blindly following trends. We do want to think about, why is this card trending down? Why is this card trending up? Again, we don't want to be like, oh, this card is trending up, put it in. Take it out for this card that's trending down. No, we definitely have to be thinking about it just a touch more than that. So, but this is one that I would see following the trend. And again, if I was more interested in trying Eldlich out more often, I would probably make that swap and try it out myself. As far as all the extra deck downward trends, I don't really know. Eldlich, the extra deck does not really need to be that important, or need to be that important. The Eldlich extra deck is not as needed. It's not as important. That's what I meant to say. So I think the trends here in the extra deck are largely unimportant as well. But I suspect the upward trend of Vampire Sucker is more people refining their lists, and Vampire Sucker is actually one of the more relevant extra deck cards to Eldlich. But again, I think overall these trends for Eldlich's extra deck do not mean a whole terribly lot. So, okay. Adamancipator is going to be the next deck up here. The only and honestly biggest trend we're seeing here is a downward trend of Sekka's Light. Now, when I actually built my Adamancipator build, I think Sekka's Light was actually seeing play 3 of in about like 50% of decks. So to see it down to 40 in a relatively short amount of time is pretty interesting. But this is actually another one that I agree with. And I do intend to make a major overhaul to my Adamancipator deck to oust the Sekka's Light and maybe some other cards and put in Called by the Grave and again, maybe some other cards. That won't be happening anytime soon. I will be having a few more Adamancipator videos, but they will be builds with the 3 Sekka's Light. However, moving forward, again, I do intend to do an overhaul to the deck profile, so you will see an update there. As well as just how we play Adamancipator. Because really the Sekka's Light, the extra draws from it are not that necessary at all. This deck often in its opening hand, it has more than enough to go off. And you don't need that much to go off, right? Like a single Doki Doki can do it. A single Adamancipator monster Excavate can potentially do it, right? It doesn't take that much. Like even Roxy's plus Supplier is enough for a full combo. So drawing more cards isn't really that useful. Honestly, with Sekka's Light, the second effect tends to be more useful for Adamancipators than the first, to put back something like your Destruction, Buster Sword, or your O-Lion, just like or your Dropsies, like some one-of combo piece like that. But I think overall that ability is not as useful as having access to other spells, namely Called by the Grave. Called by the Grave is the big one, right? To stop that Max C. And, I mean, hand traps in general, but mostly Max C. So, yeah, I don't know. Just looking at the rest of the deck and extra deck here, it does not seem to be anything too surprising as far as the statistics go, and we don't see any more trends here. It is interesting that Adamancipator is seeing a downward trend in ladder and tournament play. I think that's because it does tend to be one of the more, like, quote-unquote fragile combo decks, and we're seeing more stuff like Drytron and Eldlich. It's definitely harder for a deck like Adamancipator to play out of, like, a Herald on board as opposed to a deck like Tri-Zoo. Tri-Zoo, I've done it before. I actually did it on one of the past videos. I don't recall which one off the top of my head, but we actually did play through like a full hand of negates once, and it's possible to do that with Tri-Zoo. Not likely, but possible. But it's definitely like almost impossible to do with a deck like Adamancipator. So I suspect a rise in Drytron and Eldlich, like a lot of these changes, is why we're seeing a decline of play of Adamancipators. Okay, let's see. Lyrilisk, Tri-Brigade still holding on there in Tier 3. Here we are seeing a downward trend of the Wind Barrier statue and an upward trend of DD Crow. This is something that and you actually look at the numbers themselves too, they're seeing just about even play. It's pretty 50-50. This is something I touched on in my recent deck profile of Tri-Brigade Lyrilisk for Season 3. I mentioned the fact that as a tech option, ooh, that was my stomach, sorry about that. As a tech option, I tend to prefer DD Crow over the Barrier statue. I like the DD Crow being a level 1 winged beast actually does help us with our combos sometimes. Also the fact that it's searchable. I know the Wind Barrier statue is also searchable by Simorgh, but I think Apex Avian is way better to search for off of Simorgh than the Wind Barrier statue. I even think the Apex Avian is better at stopping your opponent's plays than the Wind Barrier statue, because the Barrier statue is just too easy to get over, right? Like, not only just because of its stats only being 1,000, but it's like, it's easier to like imperm or droplet it, or just use some other kind of like one-off negation like that. Whereas the Apex Avian is an Omni-Negate. It can stop more things. It can stop the rest of your board from being negated by something like Droplet. Yeah, I don't know. I just think it's overall, obviously it's got better stats as well. It's harder to run over. So I think overall, my opinion still holds that DD Crow is the slightly better option than the Wind Barrier statue. I don't think it's a bad card by any means. but I do kind of tend to quote-unquote agree with the trend that is reflected here. We're also seeing a downward trend in Race Vulgar, the Desperate Doom Eagle, which, to be fair, is probably the most flexible extra deck option, or like slot in this deck, but I'm interestingly not seeing another option to be played over it. So yeah, I don't really know what's going on there. But I guess it does make sense, again, because it is the most like cuttable card, quote unquote, of the Lyrilisk Tri-Brigade deck there. So even though that is all the decks on the ladder, on the tier list there, I want to go over one more deck here, which is actually Prank Kids. Even though it's currently not on the tier 3 like lists of MasterDuelMeta.com, it was actually there for like the vast majority of Season 3. It kind of went in and out a little bit, but I think for the majority of Season 3 it was there. So Prank Kids, I think, is a pretty interesting deck. I actually really want to try it myself. I just haven't quite committed. I spent a little bit of time buying into some Prank Kids secret packs, but I didn't pull the ultras I wanted to pull, so I haven't committed to crafting it yet. I'm going to wait until the new stuff comes out, and then once I've gotten my fill there, then Prank Kids might be one of the decks I move on to next. But I think Prank Kids is a pretty solid tier 3 option. Well, tier 3 Rogue, again, it seems to have been bouncing back and forth between the two slots. Seems to be more firmly in Rogue status right now. But yeah, just playing the Prank Kids in Adamancipator, and also having played against the deck a couple of times, I just think it's really interesting. It actually seems to play pretty similarly to Adamancipator too. As opposed to Excavates, with the Adamancipator monsters, you just have summons from the deck with all the different like Prank Kids monsters here. So I don't have a whole lot to say about Prank Kids at the moment because I haven't played with it, obviously, and I haven't played against it a whole lot either. So as far as these trends go, again, we see the upward trend in Nibiru, which again makes sense to me because of the more Drytron decks and Virtual World decks being played right now. But I can't particularly comment on a whole lot of these other changes because I'm not just particularly well versed in the deck. So I think I've said pretty much about all I want to say for this metagame analysis video here. Yeah, no, I think that just about covers everything I wanted to go over. So guys, thank you very much for watching. I'll have a link in the description to MasterDuelMeta.com. If you want to go check out, some of this stuff for yourself. But if you don't follow the link, it's literally just MasterDuelMeta.com, and it'll take you right there. So, yep, that's going to be all for this one. Like I said, as always, thank you for watching, especially to the end. I super appreciate that. Also appreciate if you're commenting and subscribing. That's awesome. But as long as you're just here with me along for the ride, that is A-okay with me. But without further ado, this is Xlex signing out, and I hope you have a fantastic day.